Hello, my name is Bonnie Aderstrom, and I'm on the events team here at Brookline Booksmith. Tonight it is of course my pleasure to host Michelle Sterling for the release of her book Camp Zero in conversation with Shubha Sunder. Thank you all for being here, for supporting Michelle and Shubha and our author event series. Before we do introductions, I have just a few housekeeping notes. Firstly, if you pre-ordered a book and haven't yet picked it up, or you'd like to buy a copy, you can do so at the little desk back there in the corner. Secondly, please keep your phones off or on silent for the reading and conversation, and we really appreciate you being considerate of your fellow attendees and our authors. Also, please know the event is being live streamed from the iPad right over there. Hello, YouTube. The audience is not visible to our live stream viewers, but if you don't want to be live on YouTube, just avoid walking directly in front of it and you should be okay. And finally, we will have a Q&A at the end of the event. So hold your questions till the end, but definitely have them ready to go. And now for the fun part. It is my pleasure to introduce our authors and tell you a bit about the wonderful book that we're here to celebrate. Our conversation partner tonight is Shubha Sunder. Shubha Sunder's debut short story collection, Boomtown Girl, won the 2021 St. Lawrence Book Award. It's coming out in a few weeks, and she'll actually be having an event here through our Transnational Literature Series on May 3rd, so we hope you can all come out for that as well. Shubha's work has appeared in Catapult, The Common, Crazy Horse, and Narrative Magazine, among others, and she has also received notable mentions in Best American Short Stories. Her fiction has been shortlisted for the Flannery O'Connor Short Story Award, the Hudson Prize, the New American Press Fiction Prize, and others. She is a 2020 recipient of the City of Boston Artist Fellowship Award and a 2016 recipient of the Massachusetts Cultural Council Fellowship, among several other distinctions. Thank you, Shubha, so much for joining us tonight. And of course, tonight's author is Michelle Sterling, who was born in British Columbia, Canada, and now lives in Cambridge, where she teaches literature and writing at Berklee College of Music. Her teaching there focuses on utopian, dystopian, and post-apocalyptic narratives, as well as AAPI literature. She is also the faculty advisor for the Asian Americans in Music and Entertainment Club. She is an MFA from Boston University and has held writing fellowships at Academy Schloss Solitude, Vermont Studio Center, Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, and the Banff Center for Arts and Creativity. Her writing has appeared in publications such as The Baffler, Vice, Joyland, and several others. Camp Zero, which is her first novel, just came out 2 days ago. So congratulations on the release of your debut. And of course, to tell you all a little bit about the book we're here to celebrate, Camp Zero takes place in a near-future settlement in the Canadian far north, where survivors settled after the devastating effects of climate change. Protagonist Rose is desperate to help her climate-displaced Korean immigrant mother, so she travels to Camp Zero to spy on its architect in exchange for housing. She arrives at the same time as another newcomer, and gradually they realize that there is more to the architect than they previously thought, and a disturbing mystery lurks between the surface of the camp. At the same time, there are rumors abound of an elite group of women soldiers living and working nearby at a Cold War-era climate research station. Camp Zero is an absolutely riveting story, and it explores how the intersections of gender, class, and migration will impact who and what will survive in a warming world. In a starred review, Publishers Weekly called it a stunning debut that offers a glimpse into a climate change-ravaged future, which is close enough to the present to be entirely recognizable, underlining this cleverly constructed climate fiction mystery with palpable terror. It's been compared to iconic books like Station 11. We are so excited to have you here to speak about it, Michelle. Everyone, please give a warm welcome to Shubha and Michelle.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. I used to live in Alston, so Brookline Booksmith was my go-to. So it's very cool to be back here in the neighborhood. And yeah, I'm super thrilled that we're actually upstairs as well. It's my first time in the upstairs area, so this is like so nice. Shubha, for being here with me to get a conversation.
Honor and a pleasure.
So I'm going to read a short passage from Camp Zero that takes place in Boston, because of course we're in Boston right now, well, in Brookline, but that describes one of the protagonists in the story as she leaves sort of her home in north of Boston to go find work in this place called the Floating City, which is sort of like a techno-utopian city floating in Boston Harbor. And so one of the things I should mention here, this book is set in 2049, so the climate crisis has sort of irrevocably changed a lot of sort of realities of the environment, but also in terms of how people live. And Rose is sort of interested in finding new work, a new place for herself as well. And one of the things I should mention is there's a technology in this book referred to as the Flick, which is essentially sort of like upgraded, futuristic smartphone, but it's a chip that's embedded in the back of everyone's ear when they're born. And this is something that she notices, that people can be sort of online simultaneously all the time. So I'll get right into it. On her way to the floating city, Rose dragged her duffel bags packed with books and clothes to the station and bought a one-way ticket for the next train headed south. The train was nearly full, so she walked down the length of the car and the next, finally finding a free seat in the very last car. Every single passenger was logged on, their eyes jittering as their feet unfurled, their pupils reflexively flickering to her as she passed by and then returning to the deep dream of their flick. She spent the 3-hour journey with her face pressed against the pane, watching the pine trees and clapboard houses flash by. The small towns eventually gave way to the post-industrial ruin that announced Boston was near. Defunct textile mills with smashed windows, stripped granite quarries, rivers swollen with plastic and sludge, piles of dismembered cars in the metal junkyard. People waited at the railway crossings as the train raced by, but even from the inside of the train, Rose could see that they too were on their flicks. Millions and millions of people linked to their feeds, absorbing and reprocessing what their feed offered them. It made her feel deeply and inconsolably sad. Boston, which had once been prized for its history and architecture, had transported into a receptacle for the virtual plane. Gone were the parks, the public squares, the green spaces along the waterfront. Gone were the markets, the outdoor cafes, the public gardens. Now Boston was a city of ghost kitchens and fast food chains, empty storefronts, and darkened office towers. No one wanted to live in the present tense city anymore when they could select and inhabit any historical period on their flick. Hong Kong in 2000, New York in 1970, Florence in 1500. The few people who walked the streets were guided by their flicks. She selected a model of Boston circa 1895. The flick synthesized archival photographs and created a historically compressed scene. Suddenly the people in the streets transformed into men in long jackets and hats, women in fall dresses toting parasols. A screeching tram rushed past her. She could smell smoke and horse shit and could tell by the slippery cobblestones under her feet that a rainstorm had just passed. She followed a walking path lit by gas lamps to the public garden, where the cherry blossoms scattered pink petals over the pond. When she reached Boylston Street, she saw that the Boston Public Library was only a few blocks away. She had learned about the public library in elementary school when her teacher showed her the class archival images of the ornate domed reading room and the rows of leather-bound books. The first public library in America, her teacher had said, and explained that in the pre-Flick era, it was common to visit a building that housed tens of thousands of books. You could take any book off the shelf just to feel its pages, he said, and then check it out to read at home. That would take forever, a classmate exclaimed, and the kids broke out in laughter. It was slow, but that was the point, the teacher said. You were meant to spend time with these books, to get inside them. The teacher's tone was wistful, which Rose recognized as a sentimental affectation older people sometimes assumed when they spoke of life before the flick. What happened to the library? Rose asked. After the books were uploaded to the flick, the teacher said, there were no use for their physical bodies. The rarest volumes were sent to the libraries at Walden University, and the rest were pulped to make room for the servers. Now the building is a data center, but you can still walk by and see the original building. When she reached Copley Square, she saw the library in the distance. In 1895, it had just been completed, and she walked closer. The marks in the engraved marble edifice appeared fresh and stark, free to all. She stood at the edge of the sidewalk and read the names of long-dead philosophers and writers and composers. All presumed geniuses, all men. She tapped her flick off so she could see the building in its present state in 2049. The carved names were still there, but eroded and faint. Through the windows she could make out the green glow of the servers, casting all of Copley Square in an eerie hue. Her teacher had said the books and desks and lamps and chairs had been trashed to make room for the data servers, which stacked in rows and numbered into the thousands. Each server holds the data of 1,000 people, he said. Millions of feeds are now stored in that one reading room. She looked up the building, staring deep into the green glow. Was she in there too? Everything that she searched for and thought, her interests and desires, her family and medical history, all of her memories and inner thoughts archived in a tiny black box. Even now, her feed was pinning her geographical location in place, tracking her journey, assessing her next steps. It had been with her like a second skin when she was a child, and would continue to be until she died. She wondered if this was what experiencing your own mortality felt like, knowing that one day the body you inhabit would be pulped and abandoned, while all of your data, an entire life's worth, was left shining in the server. What is a body then, she wondered, and started walking east toward the harbor. Thank you.
Ooh, that sent chills down my spine. What is a body? Well, it's so great to be in conversation with you, Michelle, and thank you for its contribution to literature and to what I see as a body of work that really addresses some of, or maybe like the biggest question of our time, which is what is the future of our species in this era of climate change? So in this novel, carbon neutral development is everywhere. I mean, like green technology has really, has replaced technology that relies on fossil fuels. But the world is far from utopic. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Even as the search for or the promise of utopia is a prominent theme. How, as a writer, do you think of utopia and dystopia, and how do you navigate these?
Yeah, thanks so much for that great question. One of my favorite questions is about the relationship between utopia and dystopia. Partially, and I think that contrast and that tension plays out in the book. There are a lot of potential utopias in this book, or sort of presumed utopias that characters attempt to create themselves, go to, flee to, and very quickly or slowly realize that they have a dystopian underbelly. I was really curious and interested in exploring that in the book, how these two seemingly sort of different spaces actually cohabit in the same space, and how people have different experiences. One person's utopia could be another person's dystopia, depending on their own kind of background, class position, or subject position. And I think what I really wanted to show was a series of reversals. So for example, in the book begins with a group of workers who arrive in 2049 in this sort of as you say, this sort of post-oil town, former boom town, now devastated. They're sort of imagining, is there a new space to live in the future, as a possible utopia. Quickly, they begin to realize that what they think is going to be a better future, in fact, is a future that's compromised by a lot of the problems they've left behind in the South. And so I wanted to sort of play with that and see how these different characters would experience it.
Yeah, I mean, from the section that you read, what is a body? Got me thinking of how, the future of bodies, what the future of dinosaurs' bodies,
Yes.
Creatures of the past,
Yes.
Was what was fossil fuels. So,
Right.
There's that aspect of dystopia as well. One of the things that makes this book so intriguing is that it can be classified in so many ways. It's a feminist narrative, it's science fiction, it's speculative. How did you think about genre as you wrote, assuming that you even did?
I definitely thought of genre. I'm really interested in genre. I think genre is something that has often got kind of a bad reputation. It's seen as kind of limiting as a form, but I actually think genre allows a writer to work against a form. And so I wanted, I was really inspired by love speculative fiction when I was writing this, and also the frame of, there are certain slight thriller vibes in the book, and I was interested in sort of using these genre elements to kind of create a particular narrative reality in the book. And so, yeah, it definitely has a dystopian element to it. I don't know if the book is pure dystopia in the sense that we don't really have this, the sort of the reason behind why this world is the way it is isn't explored. It's just sort of assumed that it happened. And typically with dystopias, there's like a kind of like antagonist that's very concrete. So we don't really quite have that in this book, but we do have a kind of destabilizing of a futuristic frame, right? So it's like a future that feels somewhat tangible. 2049, we reach out a hand, we can almost touch it, but it's different enough that it kind of hopefully allows our readers to engage with their own perception of what the future may be. So I was really interested in that, and also allowing hopefully the reader to come to their own conclusions in terms of what that reality might look like. I don't see this book as being like, this is a prophetic book about 2049 and it's only about this one vision of the future. I really see it about being about some of the present concerns we have today about thinking about, like the climate crisis, the environment we live in, labor, collectivity, contrasted also with the desires of the individual. Yeah.
And for those of us who haven't read the book, maybe this would be a good place for you to, describe it.
Yeah.
It's one of the most intricately plotted novels I've read in a long time.
Thank you. Yeah, it was not easy. I labored over that for years. So the book,
which we'll talk about later.
Yeah, so the book features 3 seemingly disparate strands. It begins, like I said, in northern Canada in this work camp. Follows a group of workers who arrive there, and the Rose character who I read is one story. The second narrative is about a young man named Grant Grimley, who is from a very wealthy and privileged Bostonian family that goes back for centuries. And this family has essentially profited from decades of extractive technologies. And he himself, and he's a graduate of the most prestigious institution in Boston, if not in the United States, called Walden University. I think you can kind of figure out what that's a stand-in for. And of course, I was also playing with ideas of Thoreau's, notions of Walden as, a space to escape to. Nature as a refuge, but also in terms of kind of individual ruggedness. So he flees his family after a traumatic event to go to the Canadian North to hopefully find redemption. And to also try to remake himself, right? And try to sever himself from the privilege that he was born into. So these 2 narratives are playing out side by side in this work camp. And simultaneously at the same time, we read this narrative of this group of all women climate scientists who are stationed at a former Cold War radar station further north. And we begin to see them kind of forge their own utopia and separate from the South due to a variety of reasons in the book. And eventually all 3 of these seemingly separate narratives converge in the novel. And so that was, for me, I just wanted to write about these 3 different sets of characters. I didn't know how they would converge. I didn't know if they would. I knew they would have to eventually for the book to feel coherent and cohesive. And so the intricate plotting, as you pointed out, is really just like me attempting, after many trial and errors, to kind of force those 3 narratives together in a way that hopefully felt sort of natural and authentic to the narrative. So there are a number of surprises and reversals that take place at the end of the novel, where we see these three sets of people from very different backgrounds come together.
Yeah, that sort of answered my next question, which is one of the things I wonder a lot as a novelist when I read novels is how much of the plot of a book sort of reveals itself to you as you write it, and then how much do you find yourself having to impose from the outside. And I know when we were talking earlier, you were saying that initially you had the Diggers and Blues, and then you had Grant, who's the privileged Bostonian trying to escape his legacy. And then this third thread of the women scientists sort of came to you by accident.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, it was really, so I knew that the book would take place in this futuristic camp, but then I was interested in some of the historical precedent of that as well. So I started reading about some of the ways that the US and Canada have kind of collaborated on military interventions in the North. And so through my reading, I kind of came across this interesting project that was spearheaded by the US and Canada during the Cold War period to build a series of radar stations across the North. I believe there were 3 different lines. And each of these stations were intended connect, potential Soviet bombers, which we launched over the Arctic Circle across the Arctic Circle, south to North American cities. And I thought I was like really struck with that image of this idea of what was referred to as a distant early morning, and what that a space like that, which was entirely lived in and manned by men, would potentially look like if a group of women were sent there. And instead of like conceiving of course, the Soviet Union, or the threat of the Cold War as being the kind of omnipresent threat out there, I was like, well, what if in the future it was really more of a climate question? And how would this group of women specifically have a potentially different experience that would foster their own sense of community? And within the book, that initial kind of utopian community is compromised by a variety of different reasons. And this group of women who have to kind of embark on some pretty intense missions that also, again, turn that utopian element into a dystopian paradigm. And I wanted to show that as well. And so there's a lot of, it's kind of, towards the second half of the book, it becomes somewhat like more like, I wouldn't say action thriller, but it has those elements where, hopefully you'll keep turning pages, but they have to kind of act out in violent ways, or they feel compelled to in a way, yeah.
Well, something that I found intriguing too was the women scientists. That whole thread of the novel is narrated from the first person plural, so
Yeah.
it's a we sort of narrative. And then we have Rose, who's in the bloomers, diggers thread of the story, who's very much an individual.
Yes.
And I was wondering, were those ideas, was that idea something that you played with as well? The individual versus the collective, and how does that inform the utopian and dystopian?
Totally. Yeah, no, I was really interested in that. I mean, I think it's because when we conceive of the climate crisis, we think of it as it is a collective, challenge. And you used the term species before. I think that's like a really apt word. We are humans on Earth. We are a species. There is a kind of connectedness that exists. But at the same time, we're also individual actors, right? With individual narratives and backgrounds and privileges and realities. And so I wanted to show characters who were within, either within a collective, so like the women scientists, which is why I employed the first person choral voice to show that element. But then also, there's a lot of kind of backstory in terms of individual characters as well. And so it felt very natural for me to write from that first person choral voice. I never really done it before, but I read a story by Julia Otsaka called Come Japanese, and that was a story that she had also written from that perspective. It really struck me as a way to both write about a group of people who are kind of conceived of as a group, right? Sort of seen as a group, but attend to drawing out certain individual qualities within that collective. And it just kind of felt right. I don't know if you experienced this with your own writing, where you're like, you just kind of get into a groove with something, and the voice sort of dictates the characterization. And so for that, I think, after I kind of struck upon that first person choral, I was like, okay, so this narrative strand is about the challenges of collectivity, the possibilities of it, but also the limitations.
Yeah, it reminded me a little bit of the movie Women Talking. I don't know if anyone saw that recently.
Yeah. I read the novel. I've never seen the film, but yeah.
Well, and it's such an interesting contrast because like within this, so you have this collective of women, and they sort of put aside their individual ambitions or motives, for the sake of their collective mission. And then you have Rose, who very much has her own ambitions, her own agendas and challenges, and she's forging it alone. But of course, she is part of a collective in a different way.
Yeah, and I think part of her journey in the novel is kind of coming from a space that is very individualized and very much about her own motivations, and then essentially kind of joining a collective and seeing the possibility of that as well. Whereas for White Owls, they kind of experience that, the women, they have a sense of their own agency, but they also, there is a kind of rupturing of that possibility as well. And so we sort of see that towards the end of the novel, that there isn't a coherency to that collective because it's not only impinged on in terms of the world that surrounds them, but in terms of their own individual desires.
So now perhaps to give us a feel for Camp Zero itself, this place in the north where a lot of the novel happens. questions. Maybe you could read for us the opening of chapter 2, and this is when Grant, the son of the Bostonian professors, who feels burdened by his legacy and is trying to escape it because he thinks he can, shows up. And so I was telling my students the other day, my writing students, it can be very useful to employ a stranger's perspective or an outsider's perspective when you need to describe a world that the insiders already know. The stranger gives you that excuse.
Well, that's a really great way of putting it. Yeah, no, definitely. So I'll read from the beginning of chapter 2. This is Grant arriving in the Canadian North for the first time. To Grant, the land looks empty. He sits in seat 1A of the Cessna, with a plastic cup of top-shelf whiskey in one hand, a decimated bag of pretzel batons in the other. He stares at this new country. The window is flecked with tiny snowflakes, the tundra dotted with evergreens. Granite mountains rise from glacier lakes, as blue as robin's eggs, or so he thinks. Grant has never seen a real robin's egg before. Birds in the floating city tend to be of the inbred variety, kept in cages and released each spring. In a more whimsical period, he had perused photos of robin's eggs on his flick, searching for the exact shade of Jane's eyes, and discovered lost egg blue was another name for the hue. He celebrated the poetry of the term then, felt it was a fitting tribute to his love for Jane, but now all he feels is lost. There, he's done it again. One dark thought and he's back in the abyss. Just like that, all the hope summoned for the journey is snuffed out. Think positive thoughts, the therapist his father hired often said. Create a better reality through self-actualization. Grant looks out the window again and tries to feel happy. Everything looks crisper here than in Boston, he concludes, and feels his mood lighten. Maybe it's a third whiskey, or the fact that he's thousands of miles from his family and all that he's left behind. No, he thinks, all the shit he's finally escaped. As the Cessna descends, he sees the land is not empty. Stretches of ice crystallized into structures. A blackened barn burned to the ground by a wildfire. A grain silo rusted red. An oil well frozen in Ford Bend. The straight shot of highway is still without the movement of traffic. Nothing is in motion. In fact, nothing seems alive. And then in the distance, he sees the green lights of Blanding Strip. A tiny compound glows below him as the plane hits the ground. The Cessna shudders in a strip of tarmac and rolls to the end of a fallow field. Grant accidentally crushes the plastic cup in his hand as condensation streams across the window. He is the only passenger in the 6-person plane, but like the good Walden boy he is, he waits for the seatbelt light to blink on before he stands. He brushes pretzel crumbs from his pants, grabs his suitcase from the overhead compartment, and carefully knots a cashmere scarf around his neck. He's almost there. As Grant drags his suitcase across the frozen tarmac, he looks back to see the Cessna rolling down the runway and taking off again. There isn't a single returning passenger? Not surprising. He assumed that the beginning of the semester would be a busy time for travel. He watches until the plane is only a dot in the sky. The terminal is in fact not a terminal, but a former gas station with a derelict motel attached on one side. The electric charging station still has 2 gas pumps out front, and the red neon sign of the motel buzzes on and off. Vacancy, vacancy, vacancy. He deposits his suitcase by the front door of the station and cleans his fog glasses with a scarf before taking in the dim yellow room. The hot dogs lazily rotating next to the tub of ancient pickles. The worn tables and slashed vinyl chairs. The red duct tape to the counter. The radio duct taped to the counter, tuned to white noise. A handwritten sign is posted in the window and warns the wayward travel. This is your final resting place. All northern roads uncared for. Only 3 people are in the station, 2 truckers with intimidating facial hair who wear wool flat hats with ear flaps and lined bomber jackets, as well as a teenage girl cashier who avoids eye contact with Grant and when he smiles and says hello. You can tell the men are taking in his canvas sneakers and thin corduroy jacket with suspicion, and he wishes he had packed something other than tweedy blazers, wrinkly button-up shirts, the one pair of tasseled loafers his mother had given him, which he now realizes will make him look like a certified Ivy twad. No hats or gloves, the kind of footwear that allows a person to tread through 5 feet of snow. He'll have to buy an entire wardrobe of wool plaid when he reaches the campus. Excuse me, I was wondering if either of you could drive me to Dominion Lake, Grant asks the man. He pats the pockets of his jacket and pulls out a wad of American bills from his wallet. Both men break into a belly laugh that shows the gold glinting in their molars. So it's true what Grant's read. The men up here have safeguarded their earnings in their teeth. Dominion Lake, one of them finally says, readjusting his hat and exposing the oil derrick tattoo on his forearm. No roads up to Dominion. The second man looks away and warms his hands against a mug of pitch black coffee. Yes, there are. Grant rolls open a map on the table and shows them. Right here. He taps a body of water shaped like a kidney. I'll pay you well if you take me there. He drops the money on the table. No roads up to Dominion, the first man repeats, and turns his head to indicate the conversation has reached its conclusion. I'm sure this is the route, Grant says, with more desperation than he'd like. The second man glances the curling line and nods curtly. Might have been an oil road once, but no one goes up there anymore. I'm actually headed to Dominion College, Grant says. You must have heard about it. I know it's a big deal for the region. The first man pauses and looks at Grant curiously. Where are you from, boy? Boston, Grant says, but corrects himself. Well, I was actually born in Cambridge in one of the Walden teaching hospitals. He's more than a little buzzed to be talking like this. Clearly these men don't care about the geographic delineations of New England. But my family is originally from Boston. Walden, the second man asks, like the university? Yes, Grant says. I graduated earlier this year. A look of disgust settles in the man's face. You're one of those nation dodgers, aren't you? Grant has never heard the term nation dodger spoken aloud. He's only read it in op-eds describing Americans who buy up swaths of land in northern Canada, desperate for the country's cold climate and wide unpopulated spaces. It's intended to be disparaging, of course, but he won't let the man see he's annoyed. I'm not, I swear. I'm here to teach English at the college. Grant pushes the wad of bills towards him anyway. Please, I'll triple the fee if you take me there. The men stand from the table, leaving the bills untouched. The second man tips his hat and says, not everything in the North is for sale.
So how did you decide to write a novel set in this place?
Why this sort of specific landscape? Well, I have family who live in Alberta, and I was actually on a journey across Canada. I'm Canadian, so I grew up in Western Canada, and I stopped over and basically visited a relative who was working in the oil industry at the time, and this was probably almost a decade ago, not quite, and this was during a period in which oil was almost $100 a barrel. So it was the peak period of oil, and the region was just full of workers. And I was really struck with this idea of a place that has, a lot of the economy is driven by extractive industries such as fossil fuel. And I wanted to imagine, what this place might look like in the future when oil is no longer being extracted, and a new commodity is potentially being profited from and explored. This idea of coal being a commodity came into play, particularly when kind of conceiving of the climate crisis. And so that was the premise, thinking of workers kind of arriving in this place in the future, and again thinking about how like a boom town can turn into a bust town, which can turn into a ghost town, and how that might in some ways sort of provide a really interesting setting for a large array of different characters arriving in this place for their own individual reasons and desires.
Yeah, I think that's another salient feature of the book. Human ambition keeps going. It's not in any way stifled by the limited resources of the planet that are growing more and more limited. If anything, it just fuels certain people's ambitions.
Yeah, absolutely, and desire for capital as well. I think that's a lot at the center of the book, which is not only how labor, employment and work is such a defining, element of how we kind of conceive of ourselves, but also the need for, home and income and stability, or however you conceive of it. And so all of these characters are sort of, looking for that in very different ways, I think, but centrally they are kind of looking for a place for themselves.
Yeah, and hierarchies in human society sort of exist in a new form here. And of course, in one sense, they don't change at all.
Yeah.
People with privilege continue to have privilege.
Yeah.
But I love how on the floating city, there's quite literally these circles.
Yeah.
And around the center, people with the most influence and privilege essentially control everybody else, and everybody else, at some level, I think know they're being controlled, but they still submit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm really interested in architecture and built spaces and how architecture as can kind of create experiences, but also divisions as well. And so like the Floating City is this kind of like gorgeous, glass and steel tower, like urban center floating in Boston Harbor, but it's quite literally separated by the ocean, right? I think there's a part in the book in which like all the citizens of the city fly by helicopter, but the workers have to go by like underground train, basically, like a subway under the ocean. And so even the way of getting there is different, and that's like partially something that I wanted to explore, like how our built landscapes and environments kind of create different distinctions and realities for people.
Yes, and our main characters is an architect.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I'm wondering if, I'm sure there are writers in the group, so if we could switch gears a little bit and talk about the process as a writer. How do you write? You also teach at Berkeley.
Yeah, I do.
You have a child.
Yeah.
How do you fit writing into your life?
Well, I see a lot of like colleagues and students in the room here. I kind of write around my teaching schedule. So when I was like working on this, like I did a lot of revisions in this book that we talked about earlier, and so I would often.
It took you like about several years.
Yeah, a long time. Yeah, like many years. To the point where people would be like, how's your book going? And they would like stop asking. They would stop asking me because they knew that I'd be like, I'm working on it, And so it was really something that I had.
I'm surprised we don't have a T-shirt.
Yeah, I'm working on it. Don't ask me anything more. It was like something I kind of had to find space for, and so I would like often work really late at night. That was something I would do, or I would like take off for like a few days and like rent like a motel room like north of Boston, and like go into these intense writing kind of spaces. So I didn't have like that sort of holistic ritual of like I wake up from like 6 a.m. and write till 8 a.m. It really was just finding time. But I don't structure ahead of time. Like I don't plot. I just kind of write through the intersection of these characters. So the biggest challenge is really kind of finding the skeleton of the book, and that took just a lot of revision, a lot of writing. And I also teach a utopian dystopian literature class at Berkeley, and so I was lucky enough that I could talk about a lot of the themes in this book through the writing of other writers and with my brilliant students as well. So it was like it allowed me to kind of be engaged in my own writing without within my workplace, even though I wasn't actively writing, of course, in class.
So this class you taught was inspired you as you went along. Were there other inspirations?
Film, is huge. Like I think I talked about Blade Runner before. The film The Thing was also like the kind of like horror film, but it had a kind of campy feeling to it. But that was also a film I thought of. But also reading other speculative fiction as well was also part of it too. But I think like the book is sort of like a mix of different genres and different moments too. Like also in terms of like really creative like memoir and also nonfiction as well.
The other thing that so struck me about the novel, as I read, there are parts that are quite dark.
Yeah.
But in the end, it is hopeful. And I wonder, are you hopeful for our species?
Am I hopeful? Like in terms of collective action? I think we have a lot of work to do. I think it's like an inherently human trait to be hopeful, somewhat, with limitations and reservations. Like I want to be hopeful, but I do think we have a huge amount of work to do in terms of like addressing just like systemic issues right now in terms of the climate crisis. So I'm hopeful that we can get those, start working towards that, but I'm not seeing a lot of indication at this moment that we are. Yeah.
Well, as you were writing, were there any times where you envisioned this novel having a darker
Yeah, totally, absolutely. I think the Indians actually surprised me how helpful it is. And I would actually say it's through conversations with my students that make me feel more optimistic. Because I think partially it was, I don't know, like I feel very privileged that I'm able to like engage with a different generation and think about, just kind of hear just remarks about envisioning the future. And it just felt like almost too bleak and reductive to kind of give a darker ending to the book, even though that was my original inclination. But through like the many experiences of revising and thinking about it, it sort of naturally cohered more into a hopeful space. But I don't know if the book actually provides any. Is it kind of open-ended, ambiguous ending of the novel? Like it's up to the reader to kind of interpret what they think where the story ends. So I wanted that for the ending. Yeah.
Yes, there is hope. But it's not. But it's not a Hollywood ending.
No, it's not. It's not tied to the bow.
No, not at all. I think now's a good time to ask you all if you have questions for Michelle.
Yeah, I'm curious, because it sounds like a lot of this book is grounded in reality. You talked about the spaceship. So why Walden University? Why not Harvard? Is this meant to be an alternate Earth? Or
Well, because it's also like the book is also set in a kind of imagined space, right? The camp itself is not set in a specific real world geographic space, even though it kind of uses certain references. I did want to create a slightly not an alternative Earth, right? It's very much grounded in reality, but that it was about the sort of representation of, say, an Ivy League university. So it wasn't about specifically like Harvard, right? But about the idea of a space like Harvard. And I thought about this a lot, and I was like, then it becomes about the specificity of that institution's history, as opposed to about, you can replace Walden with like any other kind of institution within a certain category. And so there's a lot of that within the book where it's about more the idea of the place as opposed to the specificity of the place.
I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about the process working with an editor and how much was back and forth there was with your editor.
Yeah, absolutely. So I worked really closely with, actually, it was kind of uncommon, but I worked with like 3 different editors on this book across like 3 different territories. So I had like a Canadian editor, a US editor, and a UK editor. So I got a very like international perspective on the book. But they were very collaborative, like amongst themselves, and then they'd give me a sort of like, unified front. So I didn't have to feel torn between these 3 spaces. But it was great because it was very, again, like very collaborative, detailed, but it also allowed me to kind of get a sense of a larger swath of perspectives in a way. So I had done a lot of revision on my own with this book, and then after it was under contract, I did probably one big kind of edit with them, and then one smaller one after, over a period of maybe 6 months or so, 4 to 6 months, I'd say. Yeah.
Different editors giving you contradictory.
No, they were very kind about it. So they would kind of talk amongst themselves and then send me a unified, very detailed letter that I would have to kind of read with one eye covered and then set aside and eventually kind of come back to. So I didn't really get a sense of specific perceptions, just this larger editorial format. But they were really into discussing the ideas and the themes and the characters. Because I wrote this book for so long by myself that it was actually almost uncanny talking about these characters in a way that felt very real. So I was super happy to do that.
I had a question. So you talked about your research into actual historical research pieces in Canada. What degree of research did you do for this book, and what did that process look like? Was there anything that really surprised you about your actual research?
I read broadly. I wouldn't say deep into an archive and spent labored in there for a year. It was more just to get a sense of possibility, so historical precedent, but then thinking about how that could potentially connect to a fictional space. So I was able to read, I talked a little bit about that project, some primary sources about people who'd actually worked there. There's some great archival footage online, and I did read also like architecture books about like building in northern environments as well, and then also stuff about like the Anthropocene and about kind of like climate theory too. So there was like different aspects that came into it, but it was very kind of kaleidoscopic in terms of what I was interested in, kind of what kind of appealed to me. I was also interested in a lot of like different kind of artistic interventions into kind of conceiving of this as well, and so yeah, it was a bunch of different things. Yeah.
I feel like you also just used what you had available.
Yeah.
Too. I mean, I feel like there were, echoes of this book that I realized, were kind of there in the back of my mind. Like every time I go to the Seaport area,
Oh yeah.
or even walking around Boston Public Library,
Yeah.
a lot of that land is reclaimed land.
Yeah,
It could very
that's-
well be sort of given back to the
Yes.
ocean.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like the living here in Boston, like the Boston area was a huge inspiration in terms of the sort of background of the book. And yeah, the physical spaces as well. And also by the fact that we are surrounded by sea, we have the river, the Charles River is actually a part of the book that plays into it. The sea is an important part as well, the ocean itself. And so I wanted to kind of play with those elements too that were familiar to me. Yeah.
So being a reader, and specifically not a writer,
Yeah.
I'm curious about, when I read something, curious about your human experience as the creator, as a creative experience in your process, where, when do you know, at some point, it's the end? Is it a plan, or is it like,
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
the
yeah. Someone knocks on your door and says, it's the end. They have a very, very complicated job. I mean, like, what is the end, right? I mean, like, even now with this book, like, it's done, it's published, and, I think there is something where there is a kind of internal coherence that takes place that I felt after many revisions of this book. I was like, okay, I don't know if I can, like, continue working on this, like, I don't know if that's an internal coherence or just sort of like an assumption, like I need to like finish this book, but there is a sense of like, whatever, like for me, like whatever I set out to explore, I felt like I had kind of answered it for myself in a way. I mean, I wasn't really perceiving of a reader at that point at all. I was just really kind of thinking about it in terms of like this personal project. But yeah, I think it's a really good question, and one that's like difficult to really say at one point. I'd be curious to know if anyone else has an answer as who's a writer. How do you know when you're done? What do you think?
How do I know? I
Yeah.
think it's very personal.
Yeah, it's
difficult. I feel like when I start making one change one day and then the next day I revert back to the original.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks.
My son has a question.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if I heard you properly, Navi, but I think his question was, why did you decide to become a writer?
Oh, it's a great question. Oh my gosh. Why? It's actually funny because I was actually talking about this earlier, and my mother, who's in the audience right now, reminded me, or she told me that as a child, I said, I didn't choose writing, writing chose me. And so I don't know if I ever chose to, it just sort of happened. And I think like one of the things that, as a writer, it's like a language, right? Like you speak in English, whatever language you speak in is a way to communicate, but writing is another way to communicate something that you can't just say verbally. So that's part of it as well. It's a great question. Thank you.
When you first started reading and you were talking about the media,
Yeah.
my mind started thinking about connections with 19th century literature.
Yes.
And the whole idea of actually Henry James. I don't know how much reading
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting that like the utopian imaginary, utopian literature really had its, sort of heyday during that period, and
Yes.
we've,
And in this area too.
yeah, specifically, yeah, no. So like I am interested in like visiting real world or like the remnants of real world utopia. So Fruitlands, for example, is a utopia in Harvard, Massachusetts, outside the city that I went to. And like one of the conversations I have with my students in my class, and I see one of my students here, is like the kind of like why utopias during that period and why dystopia now, right? And like what is it about our kind of present, like kind of political and social concerns that kind of makes dystopia part of this, this like a narrative premise that I think as readers and viewers, you turn on Netflix, it's mostly many dystopian narratives, and I'm a real advocate for utopian thinking. But of course, there are limitations for utopian thinking as well. And so I feel that there has definitely been a shift towards more utopian writing. And I think that there will be even more, particularly in the kind of genre of climate fiction. I think like my book, maybe has more dystopian elements to it, but I've started to see books coming out in the future that are really about grappling with the crisis, but offering solutions. And that makes me really excited.
Yes. And I think with 19th century literature, particularly talking about women's utopia,
Yes.
it's very much, oh, isn't that ridiculous?
Right.
And I think either we would be less inclined to be so satirical.
Yeah, no, I think there's more of an acceptance and sort of a space for that in some ways. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yeah.
Could end on that note of hope.
Yeah. Does anyone have last questions? Thank you so much, everyone. It's a great conversation. Thanks for questions.